So I'm going to just speak a little bit about a couple of projects and where some of my practice intersects in relation to Wales and the United Kingdom. And in a way, speaking about what it means to kind of live underneath or against a dominant culture, a dominant other, which is very much what my work in the context of Mauritius and the Western Indian Ocean, which is much of the focus of my work, kind of sits. And I guess about 10 years ago, I shifted my practice away, having studied, as Katie says, in Wales, and having been based in London for about 10 years after that. I was making work that very much explored, like many artists, diaspora, and where our positions within the UK and the national narrative, so to speak, was placed. And about 10 years ago, I felt that I needed to shift my practice outside of here and look back and be back in the spaces of my own origin and the spaces that have raised a lot of questions for myself around what it means and how much of our senses of self are actually or have been authored from the spaces of which we connect, or how much of it is actually an outside gaze. And I guess within a more formulaic and a more traditional way of talking about things, we might talk about it as oriental. But today, and as we bring that back, as amongst with lots of other artists, these questions about language and the unpacking of British colonial legacies and how much that still affects our senses of who we are and our senses of ownership of who we are. So this is kind of where my practice sort of intersects into what takes place, and I guess some of the questions that perhaps are relevant in the context of Wales today. Much of my work is very much related to, I do a lot of archive and visual photographic research as a way of kind of placing what is perceived perhaps as a dominant or perhaps the kind of the authoritative cultural voice against that of local historians, that of community storytelling, in order to kind of understand and unpick where our senses of truth or where our senses of self originate from. Myself coming from Mauritius, and why Mauritius is perhaps such an important place today in respect of both understanding European presence globally, but also in terms of self-authorship, not just in the context of India, but very much, which is where Mauritius is situated, very much in the context of Africa as well, in the sense that Mauritius was not an inhabited island before the British, the Dutch, the French colonized it back in the 1600s. It was actually an uninhabited space. And so everybody that is there today has been very much brought there through what you could understand as the mechanism of empire. It was the place where the British experimented in indenture, which was called literally the Great Experiment. And it was a site, it was a sugar plantation colony and a site of slavery for pretty much most of its history until it got its independence in the late 60s. Mauritius negotiated its independence relatively without violence from the British during the late 60s. And it is at this sort of intersecting that a lot of my work sort of starts to unravel. And spending time back there as a child, growing up between there and here, I felt that there was one of the things that I sort of became very sort of aware of is how much of the old colonial infrastructure is still represented today. For example, the House of Parliament that is the old governor's building, and how much of the identity, the iconography, is sort of still very much has been brought into the contemporary society. And I guess, in a sense, that there needs to be an understanding, a sense of acceptance, that the past cannot be erased, but therefore it has to be brought into the national narrative in some way. But what we also find in Mauritius, which is perhaps also what allows us to intersect over here, is that there is very much still a hierarchy of race. And in this sense, you have a Creole community in Mauritius, which is a kind of Indo-Afro hybridity of people between indentured laborers and slaves. You have a very small elite of white families that still very much control a lot of the industry. And there are denial and senses of shame that still run very prevalently through communities and in the ways that we describe ourselves. So it's in this way that my first body of work back in 2010, when as I started to re-embark on this, which was called Ile-de-France, and it was named after the original name of the island under the French, starts to kind of unravel these questions around the dualities in identity, these senses of essentialism that's still very much prevalent in Mauritius today, and the practice of homogeneity, in the sense that today you have a Hindu majority population that very much aligns itself with Modi and the nationalistic politics. You have an Indian community that, a Muslim community that still aligns itself very much with the Middle East. And for the Creole community, it is almost impossible to link yourself to anything outside of the island. So this sense of nationhood and this sense of authoring within of the nation is really a very fractured exercise. And so this whole piece of work starts to unravel. And the work that you're seeing right now that's playing on the screen is a work which was a film work from 2015, which kind of explores the early landscape of the colony and places this against spaces that start to question the dualities within it. And so, for example, this mountain piece that you see here right now, Lemorne Mountain, which was a site of where Maroons who were escaped slaves would congregate and hide out to sort of escape the horrors of the plantation. Today, this area has become a major spiritual focus for Creole communities in Mauritius, which allows a kind of recreation and a kind of recreation of identity beyond that of the legacies of the past, in order to somehow find some kind of agency in political repositioning that the island still finds itself within today. So a lot of the work explores ideas around traumas within the landscape, these senses of loss, but also in the importance of language and the creation of language underneath or against that of a dominant other. And just as Peter was explaining in his talk earlier, Mauritius, again, is very much still under an official British language in terms of law. French is spoken as the language of prestige, and yet the Creole language is the language of the everyday people. It's a language that is spoken by everybody, and yet at the same time, to be described as Creole, which is pretty much what everybody is on the island, is still very much something of a derogatory statement or something of denial. So in this sense, this body of work sort of sought to unravel some of these major questions and to perhaps lay out some of the major principles of what the early colony kind of brings back in terms of its importance in understanding today. I'm going to switch over to another body of work that followed this, which is called Searching for Libertalia. Apologies for my fast forwarding here, but basically Searching for Libertalia, it carries on from some of the questions that were laid out in the Ile-de-France series. And within it, sorry, excuse me, jumping between things here. It starts to present some of the further questions that start to arise, which is, for example, what are some of the conditions within which independence movements and the language that needed to be created in order to be able to author the new state outside of a post-colonial kind of context. And in this sense, I had come across a book very early on in my research, which was called A General History of Piracy by Daniel Defoe, or supposedly written by Daniel Defoe. It's written under a pseudonym. And in this, he creates a series of short stories where he heroizes these 17th century pirates. And in this one particular story of a Captain Misson is about a French pirate who steals French ships, liberates the slaves, and creates an armada and a settlement in northern Madagascar, which is then called Libertalia, and which kind of unravels from here this idea of a free state where everybody is equal. What's really interesting about this story is that it represents a European imagination of the other, European imagination of what Africa is and what this intersecting of India and the region across the Indian Ocean. And as I started to research that work and travel across and travel around parts of Madagascar, and looking for clues of what this story kind of laid out, what I found was things, for example, like Vichy artillery that had been left over from the Second World War. And it started to place into question a lot of things like, what about the dynamics of, for example, the Second World War, the examples of the Vichy in the tropics, what happened to the colonies of European empires that fell under fascism. And what sort of then starts to unravel in this body of work, this is a 3-screen video piece that I'm just sort of showing you right now, is a kind of interweaving of 3 historical narratives, one of which is this, as you can see in front of you here, this very real history of almost what is the climax of empire, the ending of empire in many senses, in terms of how it was understood at that point, and how it actually, in fact, French colonialism was was actually so incredibly pro-fascist at that point, and that actually, if Europe hadn't been able to overthrow the Nazis, the colonial system and the colonial project would have continued, and perhaps with even more veracity than had existed before. But what it does sort of unravel and open up are these really incredible questions about the hierarchies of race and the sexualization that exists within that as well. And so within this work, it sort of interweaves these narratives, the story of Captain Missile, this fictional 17th century story, but it also places it against this real tribal history of Madagascar, which is one of it is not a disempowered image. It is actually a story of an incredible mercantile network that stretches all the way back to the 1500s, and how these spaces are actually highly interconnected. And, for example, the Sakalava kingdoms used to gather in canoes of 60 men, 500 canoes, and there would be an army of 25,000 seagoing warriors that would then go on these coastal raids up along the Swahili coast. So, so the idea of this project was to kind of create, as you see now in the museum image here, is to create this pseudo archive that kind of re-represents these repetitions in history, and these repetitions of systems of violence, and how the interconnection of spaces, and how these spaces are not isolated or not apart. So in these 2 pieces of work, they are an ongoing kind of work that still continues to unpack very much what the legacies are. And I work through kind of quite a big variety of mediums, as you can see, embedding both archive photographs, as well as creating ceramic works, sculptural works, video works, and kind of, in a sense, different types of art making to bring you into different kind of proximities and sensitivities towards aspects of subject, and to kind of perhaps bring these multiple layers together. Because for sure, there's one thing that I don't want you to sort of see, which is there is no linear retelling of this. That these are, that each member, that each audience and each perspective, each angle, each time that you approach works is multiple tellings of what is, in the end, an impossible way of really being able to see the entire picture. So we try and perhaps negotiate and and navigate our way through it in a kind of, through the emotional landscape that perhaps exists within that. And so from this work, and I'm very, very quickly going to show you just one last little excerpt of a video piece. I'm going to just play you a little piece of this with the audio one. And this is a work that I created recently for the Dakar Art Summit and Art Night London last year. And in it perhaps is a different direction to a lot of the work that I have made previously, in that this work is perhaps starting to speak about, well, if we unpack these histories and we can start to understand how these legacies still exist within our senses of who we are, the senses of how we describe ourselves, our senses of reduction, then what is the language that allows us to perhaps start to speak about the strength and resilience that exists within our communities, the strength and resilience that allows us to move forward. Because one of the major aspects of decolonization, and that unfortunately still is so prevalent and difficult for us to move past, is how do we start to author a language that sees beyond just the existence within the structural and power systems that we still very much exist in. So this is a work called Prends courage, which means in Mauritian Creole means to take courage. And Mauritian Creole is very much a slave language. And so within that, we can start to understand the psychologies, or perhaps gives us leads in to some of the psychologies of what it means to have existed within such a violent system, particularly against which there is very rarely or any written account of the experiences of the subjugated. So here is a work that perhaps draws upon some of that. And so I'm just going to play this for you, and thanks for listening, and I hope it made a little sense.
Grandis. Pousser. Transmute. Transform and transfigure. Without civility, without ease, we claim our misery. Tension. Strain. Serré. Rissé. We surge. We are immune. Erstwhile, no longer. Pressure. Mass exhaled with rhythm. We are not unattended. But ancien. The ancestors. Bracing. Grasping. Redemption is upon us. Release. Sapphire. Exhale. With each breath, a delicate rhythm. Cradled. Dans le bois. Our inception.